The moment Vanessa Parks stepped back into the first-class cabin, the air shifted. Conversations quieted. Passengers turned their heads, curiosity flickering in their eyes. This wasn't just a simple apology. This was a reckoning. Desmond Carter sat with the same quiet authority, his fingers steepled, his gaze calm yet piercing. Celeste crossed her legs elegantly, her diamond earrings catching the cabin lights. Ariana? She leaned back, arms crossed, eyes locked onto Vanessa with a look that said this should be good. Vanessa swallowed hard. Her throat was dry, her pulse pounding. She had commanded first-class cabin for years, dictated the experience for passengers without a second thought. But now she was the one on display. Mr. Carter, Mrs. Carter, Miss Carter. Her voice was even, but the weight of the moment pressed down on her. I deeply regret my actions earlier. I failed to provide you with the service you deserve, and for that, I sincerely apologize. Desmond studied her. The silence stretched. It wasn't enough. Tell me, Miss Parks. His voice was smooth, deliberate. Would you have treated us differently if you had known who I was? Vanessa froze. Every muscle in her body screamed to come up with an excuse, a justification, anything, but she knew the truth, and so did he. The silence was deafening. Desmond leaned back, a small smile playing at his lips. I thought so. Ariana let out a quiet scoff. Celeste simply shook her head. Around them, other passengers exchanged knowing looks. The quiet power Vanessa had wielded over them all this time, it had just crumbled at her feet. As Vanessa walked away, shoulders stiff, Lisa Torres, the flight attendant who had watched everything unfold, met her gaze with an expression that was almost pitying. Because Vanessa wasn't just walking away from an apology. She was walking away from her career. Justice had been served. If this story had you on the edge of your seat, drop a 1 in the comments. Have you ever seen someone get what they deserve? Or have you ever been underestimated, only to prove them wrong? Tell us your story below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share for more powerful stories like this one. The hum of the aircraft was a low, steady whisper, blending seamlessly with the soft murmur of conversation in the first-class cabin. Plush leather seats stretched luxuriously under the dim glow of overhead lights. The scent of fresh espresso lingered in the air, mingling with the faintest traces of citrus from a nearby passenger's cologne. Ice clinked in crystal tumblers. The sound subtle but unmistakable, a quiet symphony of refinement. The first-class cabin of Horizon Airways Flight 927 exuded exclusivity, a world suspended above the clouds where everything was tailored for the elite. Flight attendants moved gracefully between passengers, offering champagne and warm towels with effortless smiles. Every gesture was designed to reinforce the unspoken rule of first-class travel. Here, you are special. Desmond Carter sat at ease, but his eyes were sharp, taking in the room with the quiet calculation of a man accustomed to power. A billionaire CEO, founder of Carter Global Enterprises, Desmond was no stranger to rooms filled with wealth, privilege, and the quiet arrogance that often came with them. He had built his empire in boardrooms filled with men who had underestimated him, until they learned who he was. This cabin was no different. His wife, Celeste Carter, sat beside him, exuding an effortless elegance. She was poised, wearing a deep emerald green dress that complemented her warm brown skin, her diamond earrings catching the soft cabin lighting. She didn't speak, but she didn't have to. She saw everything. Their daughter, Ariana, was absorbed in her phone, one leg tucked under her as she scrolled through a playlist. At 16, she was already as perceptive as her parents, perhaps even more so, a fierce young woman with sharp wit and an even sharper tongue. Ariana had inherited her mother's intelligence and her father's unshakable confidence. She was still young enough to react instinctively to disrespect, something Desmond and Celeste had long since learned to control. Desmond noticed a shift before his family did. Vanessa Parks, the lead flight attendant, was making her rounds, moving to the first-class cabin with practiced ease. She greeted passengers warmly, her voice carrying a bright, professional tone. A soft laugh here, a polite inquiry there. She made each traveler feel important, until she reached their row. Vanessa's entire demeanor changed in an instant. The easy warmth, the casual familiarity, it all vanished. Her eyes flicked toward them, hesitated for the briefest second, and then she kept walking. No greeting, no acknowledgement. Ariana, always the first to notice, lifted her head, removing one of her earbuds. Did she just... Desmond tapped 2 fingers lightly on the armrest. A quiet signal. Not yet. Celeste exhaled slowly, her lips pressing together in silent understanding. She had seen this before, felt it before. The rules of first class were simple. You belonged, or you didn't. And Vanessa Parks had just made a decision. Ariana's sharp eyes narrowed as she pulled her other earbud out. She skipped us, she muttered, her voice laced with disbelief. Celeste, always composed, pressed her fingertips against her temple, exhaling through her nose. It was a kind of exhale that said everything without saying anything at all. She wasn't surprised. She wasn't angry, yet, but she knew exactly what had just happened. Desmond, however, remained still. His fingers tapped lightly on the armrest, his expression unreadable. He wasn't reacting, not yet. He was watching, analyzing, measuring the weight of the moment before deciding how to play his next move. Vanessa Parks continued her rounds as if nothing had happened, moving down the aisle with the same bright professionalism she had displayed with every other passenger. She paused by a row ahead, leaning in slightly as she laughed at something a well-dressed older man had said. She placed a hand lightly on his seat, her body language relaxed, familiar, engaged. She was fully in control. Asterisk, asterisk, or so she thought. Asterisk, asterisk. Ariana shifted in her seat, turning toward her mother. Did you see that? Celeste finally spoke, her voice low and deliberate. I saw it. Ariana's lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to say more, but she hesitated. She wasn't naive. She knew what this was. It was subtle, so carefully woven into the fabric of routine that someone less perceptive might not have noticed. But she had, and so had Desmond. The air inside the first-class cabin was still calm, but just because she's used to it, but something had shifted to ignore it. The passengers were wrapped up in their own luxury, as if nothing happened. Sipping their wine. The businessman across the aisle barely glances up, scrolling through their phones, too focused on whatever deal he's closing on his laptop. The soft clinking of glasses, young couple of few rows, the occasional rustle of a newspaper. It all remained unchanged. No one else has been asked about their seat. Tension had begun. No one else has had to prove they belong. Desmond turned his head. A flight attendant passes by, just enough to glance at champagne to a white man in an expensive suit. She was moving without hesitation, confident in her place. Then Karen returned, confident in the small, standing over unspoken hierarchy. Can I get created in this space? The words are polite, but so many she says them isn't. People who thought tone is flat. The warmth she showed their biases noticeably absent, imperceptible. Amara let the beat of silence. People who assumed they had the right to decide before answering. Who belonged? Water, please. Vanessa, of course. Karen doesn't nod. Was blissfully unaware of the request she had just made. She simply turned. Ariana shook her head, and Amara watches her go, tapping one perfectly manicured nail against the armrest, placing a gentle but firm hand on her daughter's wrist. But Karen wasn't a command. Karen has no idea who she's just played. It wasn't even a warning. Amara leans back. It was a simple reminder. Watching as Karen moves seamlessly to the cabin. We know how this ends. Offering drinks with warm smiles and effortless charm. Desmond finally moved to everyone but her. He shifted slightly. She serves the businessman across the aisle into the inside pocket of his blazer, setting down a fresh glass of champagne with the same calm, calculated air he carried in the boardroom. He typed out a brief message. Enjoy. Hit send, and the older man barely acknowledges her. The first play of his laptop to notice and Vanessa Parks had no idea the game had already begun. Karen moves on. The clink of glasses and low hum of polite conversation rows ahead. First-class cabin. Mia, as Vanessa maneuvers a bright-eyed woman down white sundress, her movement beams up at the attendant. Could I have faint fizz of champagne being poured into delicate crystal flutes? Karen says, blended with the smooth murmur of passengers. She turns to Jordan, who the scent of aged whiskey lingered as she handed a glass to a sharply dressed businessman. I'll take a ginger ale. Nodding at something he said with a perfectly curated smile, handing them their drinks with practiced ease, engaging even just enough to make exchange guests feel pleasantries about their destination, the one she without missing a beat. Desmond continues down the row, his posture serving relaxed, each passenger in but turn, his gaze razor ensuring sharp. Everyone Celeste remains acknowledged and accommodated, though her fingers drummed lightly against the armrest. Minutes pass. Quiet. The businessman across the aisle already has a second glass of champagne. Was less the honeymooners have been offered snacks to go with every move, but her expression darkening as a nowhere in sight neared their row. She presses the call button. Vanessa reached the man across the aisle, cutting through the ambient light as she asked. Karen returns. Whiskey or champagne? Her expression carefully neutral. The older gentleman smiled. Yes, champagne. Amara meets her gaze. Vanessa nodded, pouring with precision water, handing it over with a polite. Karen's lips pressed together in a tight line. Then, without missing a curling around the tray, she continued to the next seat. We're still getting everything sorted. Never turning toward Desmond, Celeste, or Ariana. Amara's eyes glanced her way. Ariana now. Just her lips parted, scattered glasses left, as if waiting for Vanessa to correct herself, everyone else. To realize her mistake for a split second, but it never happened. Something flashes in Karen's expression. The cart rolled past. A flicker of annoyance kept going. Of something Ariana let out a quiet scoff. Then, just as quickly, "Are you serious right now?" Her features back into control. Celeste inhaled deeply. "I'll get when I can," before releasing a slow, measured sigh. Turning and walking away. She didn't need to speak. Word. David Sloan, exhale, said businessman. Desmond didn't react. He's been trained to tune out distractions. His stay focused on work across the screen, in the middle of long haul flights. Short, deliberate something strokes. About the exchange. Then, just as quickly, he's slipped back inside his years. Lisa Torres, service flows, a fellow flight attendant, effortless, had been watching from a few rows away. He's never had to ask twice. She had noticed a slight hesitation. The thought lingers. His body doesn't dwell on it. The deliberate way she had skipped over one row, cufflink, without even pretending to pause, and goes back to his laptop. Lisa wasn't new to this job. Mia, on the other hand, situations like this doesn't let it go so silent exclusions. She nudges tiny acts of dismissal that were easy to brush off as oversights. Jordan glanced. This wasn't subtle. See what? It wasn't accidental. She completely Vanessa had done it with the same Jordan frowned slightly, greeting the man and looking over his shoulder. He hadn't been paying attention before. But now that Mia mentions old money, the interaction she had assessed the Carters in an instant. Maybe decided they weren't worth the courtesy. Mia, Lisa's stomach tightened. No, but she said nothing. She skipped her on purpose. Vanessa Jordan exhales, offering leaning back to a woman in a navy pantsuit. What are we supposed to do about sharing a polite chuckle with the man doesn't answer right away. Ensuring instead, every passenger she looks toward Amara, first-class experience, composed, unmoved, every passenger, as if the entire moment meant nothing. Ariana sat can back, feel it, her arms crossed over her chest, quiet but bouncing impatiently. And now that she's seen the carpet, she can't unsee it. This is dinner service crazy, and Kara moves with the same effortless charm. Celeste placed a hand on her knee. A small reminder. Smile. Not here. She stops beside David Sloan's seat. Desmond remains slightly toward her. His expression we have unreadable. 2 options for dinner but tonight. Inside he was assessing, calculating, warm, inviting encounter people grilled like salmon and vegetables or pasta. People who thought their biases were invisible. Which would you small, quiet David doesn't even glance up from his laptop. But salmon, what Vanessa didn't realize, already reaching for a glass of wine beside him. A few minutes passed before Vanessa returned. Karen replies, pushing the cart a steaming plate in front of him. Moving through the aisle with the same careful balance of efficiency and repeating the same line past their row again. Accommodating their preferences toward them for half a second before snapping reaches Amara. Lisa's fingers tighten around Karen head to the drink cart. The pleasant expression on her face dims. She had worked eyes narrowing just long enough before she speaks. When something we have 2 options tonight. She hesitated. She says, glancing toward Desmond, warm Celeste, and Ariana. Grilled salmon, wasn't sure whether to step in pasta or let it play out. Creamy sauce. Desmond made the decision. Amara meets her gaze. He reached into his pocket. I'll have the salmon. Pulled out his phone once Karen's more, fingers tightened and with the smallest tilt of his head. We're out of salmon. Sent another message. A pause. Lisa felt a chill run down her spine. Heavy pause. Whatever Amara's eyes flicked briefly. It wasn't David's plate as a hum of conversation already settled into a perfect portion of salmon. The scent of gourmet meals rising from the fresh first-class cabin. She glances toward the young silverware against porcelain mixed with a low murmur of contented passengers salmon, scanning the golden menus. Crust glistening each under one the cabin selection of carefully curated dishes. Karen filet mignon with black truffle butter. The moment stretches. Seared salmon over saffron risotto. Amara does handcrafted vegetarian truffle pasta. She already knows. The choices were finally luxurious. She tilts her head slightly. A promise of the first-class experience. Then I'll have the pasta. Vanessa Karen sets the plate down with just a little too much force. Distributing menus with a smile that barely faltered. She engaged turning sharply and walking away, complimenting one passenger's tie, slowly, laughing she doesn't move another's joke, doesn't reach her for a voice carrying right just enough warmth to make her feel catered to. She lets the moment settle around then her. She arrived at row lets 3. Herself fully absorb the weight menu. Her fingers curl slightly against the armrest. It's not the first time she's dealt with something like this. It won't be the last. She didn't stop long enough for it to seem like an oversight. Instead, she barely slowed, a cold efficiency replacing the warmth she had so freely offered to everyone else. Without preamble, she set a single tray on the lowered table in front of Desmond Carter. We only have the chicken left. Her voice was clipped, devoid of the hospitality she had effortlessly extended elsewhere. There was no regret, No explanation, just finality. Ariana blinked, then let out a quiet, disbelieving laugh. "Wait, what?" Celeste, who had been patiently waiting for the moment to unfold, tilted her head slightly. The sharp chime of her bracelet against the armrest was the only sound she made, but her lips curled into a slow, knowing smile. Desmond didn't react right away. He simply tilted his head slightly. His voice, when he finally spoke, was smooth and unhurried, his tone more observation than accusation. The others were given options. Vanessa's posture stiffened, but she kept her gaze just above their heads, never quite meeting Desmond's eyes. "First-class meals are limited," she said, shifting her weight as though eager to leave. "Priority goes to high-status passengers." A ripple of silence spread through the air. The words hung between them like poison, seeping into the moment, thick and unmistakable. The implication wasn't subtle. It wasn't even veiled. It was a statement, a clear line being drawn between those who deserved the luxury of choice and those who, in her eyes, did not. Celeste let out a sharp, quiet laugh. It wasn't one of amusement. It was the kind of laugh that people like Vanessa never knew how to interpret, the kind that warned of something simmering just beneath the surface. Ariana, on the other hand, had no interest in masking her reaction. She shook her head, her disbelief evident. "That's crazy," she muttered, more to herself than anyone else. Desmond? He remained still. The unreadable expression that had carried him through years of boardrooms, negotiations, and power plays didn't falter. He didn't push the tray away, didn't call for a manager, didn't demand an explanation. He simply reached for his phone. A single text. Another calculated move. Lisa Torres, standing near the galley, caught the moment from the corner of her eye. She had known this was coming. She had watched Vanessa's deliberate avoidance, her too casual dismissal, the way she had strategically navigated around one row in particular. And now, she watched as Vanessa turned on her heel, walking briskly away, too quickly, as though she already knew she had just made a mistake. Lisa knew better than to interfere, but even as she resumed her duties, something told her she should keep watching, because this wasn't over. Not even close. The intercom crackled to life, cutting through the quiet hum of conversation. Asterisk, asterisk, Miss Parks. Report to the cockpit immediately. Asterisk, asterisk. Vanessa froze, her grip tightening around the drink cart's handle. The murmurs in the cabin softened as heads subtly turned, a few passengers exchanging glances. It was rare for a flight attendant to be summoned mid-flight, and never like this. For a split second, she hesitated, her brain scrambling for an explanation. Maybe it was a routine check. Maybe the captain needed assistance with something. No. Something about the way the announcement had been delivered made her skin prickle. It was direct, cold, not a request, but a command. She forced a smile, smoothing her uniform out of habit, before turning to Lisa, who was stationed near the galley. "Can you handle the rest of service?" Her voice remained light professional, but Lisa caught the brief flicker of unease behind her eyes. Lisa simply nodded, watching as Vanessa strode toward the front of the cabin. Vanessa kept her chin lifted as she walked, her heels clicking lightly against the plush carpet, but her heart pounded harder with every step. She ignored the way the passengers' gazes followed her. First-class travelers were used to watching people fall apart discreetly, and she refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing any cracks in her composure. But when she reached the cockpit door, her fingers felt stiff as she knocked. A beat of silence. Then the door unlocked with a quiet click. She stepped inside, and immediately she knew this was bad. Captain Russell Hanley sat in his chair, hands clasped over the control panel, his gaze steady but firm. The co-pilot barely looked at her, focused intently on the instruments in front of him. But what made Vanessa's stomach twist was the small screen mounted near the panel, where a video call was already in progress. Jonathan Hale, director of operations for Horizon Airways, stared back at her. His expression was unreadable, but his silence was heavy. She clasped her hands behind her back, her instincts kicking in. Years of experience had trained her to stay composed, no matter the situation. "Captain, sir," she greeted smoothly, though her throat felt dry. "I was asked to report." Miss Parks, Captain Hanley interrupted, his voice carrying an edge she had never heard before. Do you know why you're here? The question hit like a slow-moving train. She swallowed, forcing her shoulders back. I'm afraid I don't, sir. Jonathan Hale finally spoke. Then let me enlighten you. He leaned forward slightly, his voice devoid of emotion. We received a report regarding a serious service issue in first class. Specifically, one concerning Mr. Desmond Carter and his family. A chill spread through Vanessa's spine. Her pulse stuttered. Jonathan's next words sent her stomach plummeting. Miss Parks, are you aware of who Desmond Carter is? Vanessa's breath caught in her throat. The temperature in the cockpit seemed to drop, though she knew it was just her body's response to the sudden rush of adrenaline. Her heart pounded against her ribs as her brain scrambled to process what she had just heard. Desmond Carter. She had known his name sounded vaguely familiar, but she hadn't placed it. She had assumed he was just another businessman, another high-earning but ultimately unremarkable passenger who had the money to sit in first class. She had assessed him, as she did with every passenger, and decided, without thinking too hard about it, that he didn't belong. And now Jonathan Hale had just shattered that illusion. Desmond Carter wasn't just a passenger. He wasn't just rich. He owned the very airline she worked for. The edges of Vanessa's vision blurred slightly. The words, owns Horizon Airways, replaying her mind like a relentless drumbeat. Captain Hanley's gaze remained locked on her, his fingers tapping once against the console before folding over his knee. Do you have any idea what you've done, Miss Parks? Vanessa forced herself to breathe, but it felt like she was drowning in open air. She started, but the words stuck in her throat. Jonathan Hale leaned in closer on the screen, his expression impossible to read, but there was something in his eyes, something that made her stomach churn. Let's go over what's happened so far, he said, his voice cool and controlled. You deliberately skipped over the Carter family during greetings. You refused them drink service. When meal service began, you failed to provide them with a menu, and when questioned, you told them that priority goes to high-status passengers. He let the words settle. They hung in the air like a death sentence. Vanessa's fingers twitched at her sides. She wanted to defend herself. She wanted to say it was a misunderstanding, that she had been busy, that she had simply overlooked them. But she knew those excuses wouldn't work, because they weren't true. She had made a decision, a quiet, instinctive judgment, and now she was standing in a cockpit, being held accountable for it. I didn't, she tried again, but Jonathan cut her off. You didn't what? His tone sharpened, his patience razor-thin. Didn't think you'd get caught? Her mouth snapped shut. For the first time since stepping onto this flight, Vanessa felt truly powerless. Captain Hanley let out a slow breath through his nose, shaking his head. Miss Parks, let me make this crystal clear. You have spent the last hour treating the owner of this airline and his family as if they were beneath the level of service you provide to every other first-class passenger. Vanessa's stomach twisted painfully. Jonathan adjusted his tie, his next words hitting harder than the turbulence she wished would shake the plane right now. You assumed, he said smoothly, that you could decide who belonged in first class and who didn't. And now, Miss Parks, you're about to find out what happens when you assume wrong. She didn't realize she was clenching her fists until her nails dug into her palms. A slow, unbearable silence stretched between them. Finally, Jonathan exhaled, leaning back slightly. Desmond Carter has requested that you personally return his family and deliver a formal apology. Vanessa swallowed hard. You will ensure they receive the full first-class experience they paid for, Captain Hanley added, his voice steel. And you will do it in front of every passenger who saw you dismiss them. Her hands felt clammy. Her heart pounded like a ticking time bomb. She had spent years commanding first class, moving through cabins with authority, controlling the passenger experience on her terms. Now she was being ordered to walk back into that cabin and apologize to the very people she had dismissed. A fresh wave of humiliation surged through her. Understood. Hanley prompted, though it wasn't a question. Vanessa nodded stiffly, forcing her lips to move. Yes, sir. Jonathan Hale's face remained unreadable as he gave a slow nod. Then go fix your mistake. Asterisk now. Asterisk, asterisk. Vanessa turned toward the cockpit door, but the weight in her chest told her what she already knew. There was no fixing this. She had already lost. Vanessa stepped out of the cockpit, her breath shallow, her hands trembling at her sides. The first-class cabin, which she had always moved through with ease and authority, suddenly felt foreign, like a stage she had been forced onto without rehearsal. Every passenger now an unforgiving audience. The whispers had already begun. As she walked past the rows of plush leather seats, she could feel their eyes tracking her every movement. Some passengers pretended to be uninterested, their gazes flicking toward their phone screens or the in-flight menu. But the subtle shifts in posture, the hushed murmurs, it was obvious. They knew something was wrong. Lisa Torres stood near the galley, arms crossed. She didn't say anything, didn't smirk, didn't gloat, but she didn't look away either. Vanessa forced her chin up, trying to summon the polished confidence she had always carried. But it wasn't there. Not this time. Her feet felt heavier with each step as she approached row 3. Desmond Carter sat exactly as she had left him, calm, composed, one hand resting lightly against the armrest, his expression unreadable. Beside him, Celeste's gaze was sharper now, as if she already knew what was coming. Ariana was less restrained, her arms folded tightly over her chest, eyes locked onto Vanessa with open expectation. Vanessa swallowed hard, stopping just in front of them. The silence stretched. For the first time in her career, she felt truly small. She cleared her throat lightly, but her voice came out stiff, unfamiliar. Mr. Carter, Mrs. Carter, Miss Carter. Her fingers twitched against the fabric of her uniform as she inhaled, forcing out the words. I would like to sincerely apologize for my lapse in service earlier. She felt her cheeks burn, the weight of every surrounding passenger's attention pressing into her. Desmond tilted his head slightly. A lapse. His voice was smooth, casual, but there was an edge to it. Vanessa's stomach twisted. It was never my intention to make you feel unwelcome or provide anything less than the highest standard of service, she continued, though the words felt hollow, empty. Celeste exhaled softly, shaking her head just once. Ariana scoffed. Desmond didn't speak right away. He let the silence linger, stretching it just long enough for the weight of it to settle deep in Vanessa's chest. Then he leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. Before you continue, he said, his voice measured, I have a question. Vanessa's breath caught. Of course, sir. Desmond's gaze held hers. At any point during this flight, did you ask any other first-class passengers if they were in the right seat? The question hit like a slap. Vanessa felt a cold sweat break along the back of her neck. She already knew the answer. So did everyone else watching. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Desmond leaned back. I'll take that as a no. Ariana let out a quiet, almost amused laugh. Celeste crossed one leg over the other, tilting her head slightly. And yet, she murmured, you told us priority service goes to high-status passengers. Vanessa felt the ground beneath her shift. The murmurs among the other passengers grew louder. The truth was hanging in the air now, undeniable, irreversible. For the first time in her career, Vanessa Parks had no control. And she knew it. Vanessa's throat tightened as the question settled between them like a stone sinking in water. Desmond's voice had been quiet, but it carried the weight of something undeniable, something she couldn't wriggle free from. She opened her mouth, instinctively searching for an answer, for something, asterisk, asterisk, anything asterisk, asterisk, that wouldn't make her sound exactly like what she was beginning to realize she had become. But the words wouldn't come, because there was no answer that wouldn't expose the truth. The silence dragged on, stretching just long enough to make her skin prickle, just long enough for the surrounding passengers to shift in their seats, sensing the raw discomfort thickening the air. She felt their attention pressing into her like an unbearable weight. Desmond didn't move, didn't blink. He didn't have to. Celeste leaned forward slightly, her voice so low and smooth it was almost gentle, except it wasn't. It was calculated, cutting in a way Vanessa hadn't been prepared for. So why us? Vanessa's breath caught. She wanted to look anywhere else, at the aisle, at the trays she had placed before them, at the safety pamphlet tucked neatly in the seat pocket, but her body betrayed her, keeping her frozen under their scrutiny. Her lips trembled, and the first flicker of realization hit her chest like a fist. There was no escape. Ariana let out a quiet, humorless laugh. Yeah, I'd love to hear this one. Vanessa's pulse hammered in her ears. She had never felt so exposed, so completely unraveled. The moment she had dismissed them as just another set of passengers who didn't fit into the image of first class she had created in her head. She had set herself on this path. And now, she was paying the price. Desmond finally exhaled through his nose, tilting his head slightly. You can't answer, can you? She clenched her hands behind her back, forcing her expression into something neutral, something she hoped didn't show the full extent of her panic. She swallowed hard. I sincerely regret of my service. Desmond raised a hand, stopping her cold. Not what I asked. His voice remained steady, a controlled level of patience that somehow felt even more dangerous than anger. I asked if you questioned any other passenger's place in this cabin. She felt the walls closing in. She had spent years walking through first-class cabins, commanding them, dictating who got what level of service. She had never questioned it before. Never had to, because people like her, people who made these judgments every single day, never expected to be called out for it. She had been so sure, so comfortable in her assumptions that she had let her guard down. And now, the truth was out in the open, and it wasn't letting her go. Vanessa sat in the galley, her back pressed against the counter, fingers gripping the edge so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She wasn't sure how much time had passed since she had walked away from the Carters, but her body still carried the weight of the humiliation she had just endured. Her uniform felt tighter, the fabric stiff against her skin. She could still hear Ariana's quiet laughter in her head, Celeste's sharp, knowing tone, and worst of all, Desmond Carter's voice. Her breathing was shallow, her pulse an unsteady drum beneath her ribs. The overhead announcement signaled their descent. The flight was almost over. If she could just get through the last few minutes, land, step off this plane, she could figure out a way to salvage. The phone on the wall buzzed, a low, sharp sound that made her jump. She hesitated. For the first time in her career, she considered letting it ring. But something in the back of her mind told her this wasn't a call she could ignore. Swallowing the lump in her throat, she forced herself to lift the receiver, pressing it to her ear. "This is Miss Parks," she said, struggling to keep her voice even. The response was instant, calm, controlled. "This is Desmond Carter." Her breath caught. The plane was still in the air, but she felt like she was plummeting. She pressed her lips together, fighting to keep the tremor out of her voice. "Mr. Carter, let's not waste time." His tone was smooth, but there was nothing soft about it. "I only have one question." Vanessa swallowed hard, gripping the phone tighter. "Would you have treated my family differently if you had known who I was?" The cabin noise faded. The hum of the aircraft, the occasional clatter of a tray, even Lisa Torres moving nearby, all of it disappeared under the weight of his words. She knew the answer. So did he? Silence stretched between them, suffocating. Her lips parted slightly, but she had nothing to say. And for Desmond, that silence was an answer in itself. "You don't regret what you did," he said finally, his voice quiet, almost thoughtful. "You regret that it was me." The finality in his tone was worse than if he had yelled, worse than if he had threatened her career, because it meant there was nothing left to discuss. The line clicked. Vanessa slowly lowered the phone, staring at it in her trembling hands. The plane was still descending, but she already knew where she was going. Straight down. Vanessa stood frozen, the phone still clutched in her trembling hand. The cabin noise returned in a slow, creeping wave. The hum of the engines, the quiet chatter of passengers preparing for landing, the faint rustling of newspapers and seat belts clicking into place. But none of it felt real. It was like she had been dropped into an entirely different world, one where she no longer had control over anything. She swallowed hard, but her throat remained painfully dry. She had known the answer to Desmond Carter's question before he even asked it. She had felt in the pit of her stomach the second his name was spoken in the cockpit, but saying it aloud, admitting it, that had sealed her fate. The words still rang in her ears. Asterisk, you don't regret what you did. You regret that it was me. Asterisk, that was the moment she knew. She had spent years walking through first-class cabins, deciding who was worthy of her best service and who wasn't. She had done it so often, with such effortless certainty, that she had stopped questioning whether her decisions were fair. She had stopped even noticing them. And now, someone had finally noticed her. A shaky breath escaped her lips as she placed the phone back on the receiver, her fingers lingering on it for a second too long. Lisa Torres was watching her. She didn't speak, didn't smirk, didn't say, "I told you so," but she didn't look away either. Vanessa felt a surge of resentment, a fleeting instinct to defend herself, to claim she'd been misunderstood, that she was just doing her job. But that was the problem, wasn't it? Her job had never been about doing what was right. It had been about doing what she could get away with. And this time, she had picked the wrong man to dismiss. A deep, sinking feeling settled in her stomach as the flight continued its descent. She knew what was coming. She wasn't going to walk off this plane like she had every other flight. She wasn't going to check into her hotel, have dinner with the crew, go home, and prepare for her next shift like nothing had happened. When the wheels touched the runway, her career would crash with them. She had made a decision when she skipped that row. And now, that decision had been made for her. The wheels touched down with a soft thud, sending a shudder through the aircraft as it decelerated. Passengers stirred, stretching their legs, powering on their phones, preparing to re-enter the world below. For most, this was just another landing. For Vanessa, it was the beginning of the end. She barely heard the usual landing announcement from the captain, her mind a blur of static. The plane rolled toward the gate, the anticipation thick in her chest. Maybe, just maybe, she was wrong. Maybe this wasn't the end. Maybe, asterisk, asterisk. The intercom crackled. Asterisk, Miss Parks, report to the jet bridge immediately. Asterisk, a ripple of hushed whispers moved through the cabin. Vanessa's fingers curled at her sides. Her throat tightened. The voice had been calm, professional, too professional. Lisa Torres glanced at her, but said nothing. No smirk, no expression of satisfaction. Just quiet, knowing silence. Vanessa forced her feet to move. She smoothed her uniform out of habit, tried to maintain a shred of composure as she walked toward the front of the cabin. Every step felt heavier, like she was marching toward her own sentencing. Passengers tracked her movement, some pretending not to look, others watching openly. She caught glimpses of expressions, asterisk, asterisk, mild curiosity, quiet judgment, restrained amusement. Asterisk, asterisk, this was first-class entertainment now. She passed row 3. Desmond Carter sat with effortless ease, one hand resting lightly on the armrest. He didn't acknowledge her, didn't turn his head, didn't smirk, didn't need to. The sheer dismissal of it made her stomach turn. Celeste, however, lifted her glass slightly in a slow, almost mocking gesture before taking a sip. Ariana didn't bother with subtlety. She smirked. Vanessa felt the heat rise to her face, but she couldn't stop now. She reached the exit, hesitating for a fraction of a second before stepping forward. The moment she crossed the threshold into the jet bridge, she knew it was over. 2 men in dark suits stood waiting, asterisk, asterisk, airline executives. Asterisk, asterisk, their presence was unmistakable, their posture stiff and unreadable. Behind them, a uniformed security officer stood with his hands clasped in front of him, his expression strictly neutral. They weren't here for the crew. They were here for her. She barely had time to process it before one of the men, a tall, graying figure with a corporate pin on his lapel, spoke. "Miss Parks," he said, his voice clipped measured, "you'll need to come with us." The weight of finality in those words hit her harder than she had anticipated. Her stomach twisted. Her fingers curled into the hem of her uniform skirt. "Am I being terminated?" she asked, hating how small her voice sounded. The executive's expression didn't change. "That decision will be made after your hearing." Hearing. The word fell heavy. Permanent. A pit formed in her stomach. She had seen this before, had whispered about it with other crew members when a flight attendant was quietly pulled aside after flight, never to be seen in uniform again. She had never imagined she would be on the other end of it. The security officer took a small step forward, not threatening, not aggressive, but firm. It was happening. Vanessa forced her chin up, biting the inside of her cheek to keep the emotion from surfacing. She nodded once. Then she walked forward, past the executives, past security, past the invisible line that separated her past from what came next. And just like that, Horizon Airways closed its doors on her. Vanessa sat in the back of a taxi, staring out at the blurred city lights streaking past the window. The silence inside the car felt suffocating, pressing in around her like a weight she couldn't shake. Her uniform, once a symbol of authority and control, now felt like a prison she had been dragged out of, stripped of everything it once represented. Her hands trembled slightly as she pulled out her phone. There were dozens of unread messages, some from co-workers, others from people she hadn't spoken to in years, suddenly curious about the rumors spreading like wildfire. She didn't need to read them to know what they said. Asterisk, what happened? Asterisk, asterisk, tell me this isn't true. Asterisk, asterisk, I heard you got pulled off the flight. Are you okay? Asterisk, she wasn't. Her thumb hovered over the screen, but she didn't reply. What could she say? That her career was gone? That she had spent years deciding who belonged, only to find out she never truly did? That the moment she thought she was untouchable was the same moment she set her own downfall in motion? Her screen lit up with another notification. This one was different. A single message from an unknown number. Asterisk, I hope you learned your lesson. Not just for today, but for every day before today. Asterisk, Vanessa's breath hitched. She didn't need to check who it was from. Desmond Carter. The meaning behind those words sank into her like a blade. This wasn't just about what had happened on the flight. It was about every time she had made that choice. Every moment she had dismissed someone without thinking, every assumption she had justified in her head, every time she had acted as though she was the one with the power to decide who deserved to be there. She had gotten away with it for years, until she didn't. Her fingers clenched around the phone. Her heart pounded, but not with anger. Asterisk, asterisk with shame. Asterisk, asterisk. Because deep down, she knew. He was right. The taxi slowed to a stop outside her apartment. She barely registered paying the driver before stepping out, the cool night air hitting her like a slap. The streets were quiet, but the city hummed around her, full of people moving forward, carrying on. For the first time in her life, she had nowhere to go. She wasn't Vanessa Parks, first-class flight attendant, gatekeeper of exclusivity. She was just another person standing on a sidewalk, lost in the middle of the city that didn't care who she was. Her phone buzzed again, another message lighting up the screen. This time, she didn't look, because for the first time, she wasn't the one in control. And she never had been. Vanessa stood in the dim glow of the streetlights, her phone still clutched in her hand, her mind replaying every moment of the last 12 hours. The scent of rain lingered in the air, the city around her alive with movement. Cars rolling by, distant laughter, the rhythmic tapping of hurried footsteps on pavement. Life continued, unbothered, unchanged, asterisk, asterisk, except for her. How had it happened so fast? One moment, she had been walking to the first-class cabin, gliding past passengers with the same quiet authority she had carried for years. The next, she was standing on the outside, looking in, realizing she had never been as untouchable as she thought. Desmond Carter's words still echoed in her head. You don't regret what you did. You regret that it was me. And that was the truth, wasn't it? She had spent her career making choices without consequence, assuming that the way she saw the world was the way it was supposed to be. She had built an unspoken system in her mind, a hierarchy of worthiness. Some passengers earned the warmth of her service. Others had to prove they belonged. And all along, she had convinced herself that no one noticed. But people do notice. They notice when they are overlooked. They notice when their presence is treated as an exception rather than a norm. They notice when the rules don't seem to apply the same way to everyone. She had been so sure of herself, so sure of the silent power she held, the way a simple choice, a skipped greeting, a withheld menu, a second glance at a boarding pass, could reshape someone's experience without ever raising her voice. Now, she was the one being dismissed, and it burned. How many times had she walked past injustice, choosing not to see it because it had never affected her? How many times had she justified the discomfort in someone's eyes, convinced herself that they were imagining it, that they were just reading too much into things, until it happened to her? The thing about power is that it's only real until someone takes it away from you. And when that moment comes, when the doors that always open for you suddenly close, when the respect you took for granted is gone, when you are no longer the one making rules, you finally understand. Too late. Her fingers hovered over her phone screen, but there was nothing left to say. No excuse she could make, no apology that would change anything. Because this wasn't just about one flight, one mistake, one bad judgment call. This was about every moment before it. The only question that mattered now was what she would do next. Vanessa inhaled deeply, the cold air filling her lungs as she stared at the city stretching out before her. The reality of everything that had happened settled like a weight on her shoulders. Asterisk, asterisk, a weight she had never expected to carry. Asterisk, asterisk. For so long, she had walked through the world with quiet certainty, believing she was in control, believing that her choices were small, insignificant, harmless. But now she understood. They were never small. Every unspoken judgment, every assumption, every time she had decided, in a fraction of a second, who deserved her respect and who didn't, it had all led to this moment. A lifetime of choices she had never been forced to think about. Asterisk, asterisk had finally caught up to her. Asterisk, asterisk. And now she had no power, no authority, no uniform to shield her from the consequences of her own actions. She was just another person standing alone on a sidewalk, staring at her phone, knowing that the words staring back at her weren't just a message from Desmond Carter. They were a message to herself, a lesson she could no longer ignore. Because that's how it happens, isn't it? We walk past injustice every day, pretending it doesn't matter. We assume the people calling it out are exaggerating, making a big deal out of nothing. We tell ourselves that if it were really a problem, someone would have done something about it by now, until it happens to us. And then, suddenly we understand. Too late. So now, the question is yours. Have you ever experienced something like this? Have you ever been dismissed, ignored, made to feel like you didn't belong in a space you had every right to be in? Asterisk, asterisk. Or have you ever been on the other side, so sure of your own judgments that you never stopped to question if you were wrong? What would you have done? Drop a comment below. Let's talk about it.